In 1900, at the very tail end of Queen Victoria's long reign, in the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, West Africa, a British governor demanded to sit on a stool to show his authority over the local Ashanti people. But the problem was that this was no ordinary stool. Inlaid with gold, it was not merely a political throne, but a sacred symbol too. And his demand would ignite a rebellion not led by a king or a general, but by a 60-year-old Queen Mother. This is the story of the War of the Golden Stool. The war, fought in 1900, was the fifth and final conflict between the West African Kingdom of the Ashanti and the British Empire. And whilst British redcoats fighting in the jungle might spring to mind, most of the British troops in this war, apart from the officers and NCOs, were actually local Africans from Britain's neighbouring colonies. The Kingdom of the Ashanti in modern-day Ghana was actually a sophisticated confederation of tribes, established in the early 18th century by their first king, Osei Tutu. He developed a highly disciplined army that became the scourge of his neighbours, and the Ashanti became the dominant power in that part of West Africa. Early on in his reign, during a gathering, the high priest called down the Golden Stool from heaven. Supposedly, the stool landed, gently, in the king's lap, confirming his authority as leader of the confederation. As its name suggests, it was inlaid with gold. But it wasn't the precious metal that made it worth fighting a war over. Stools in Ashanti culture were a symbolic right to lead, but the Golden Stool was more than that. It was the spiritual link between the living, the dead, and those to come, as well as between the king and his people, and between each clan and the state. Whoever controlled the stool effectively controlled the state. The British presence on the Gold Coast of West Africa had originally been confined to a series of forts on the coast, from where they had transported slaves across the Atlantic. And many of those slaves were supplied from prisoners captured in their wars by the Ashanti. The first clash between the two sides came in the 1820s, when the Ashanti tried to extend their control all the way to the coast, including those forts. That very first war had ended in Ashanti triumph, with the British governor, Sir Charles McCarthy, killed, and his head taken to the Ashanti capital of Kumasi, where his skull became part of a gold-rimmed drinking cup. Before I go on, I just want to thank HelloFresh for sponsoring today's show. Now, I recently discovered them, well actually Sarah did, so credit where it's due, and it's been a real game changer, enabling me to eat healthy meals whilst cracking on with producing my history shows. I love the fact that my meals are delivered to my door and include all the ingredients I need, so no mad rushes down to the supermarket. And because they send just the amount you need, no wastage either. Each meal comes with a recipe card and is contained in its own bag. And you can choose how many meals you want each week and for how many people, so real flexibility. And that flexibility also allows you to pause for holidays and to cancel whenever you want. Click on the link appearing now or in the description and use the exclusive code THC50 to get 50% off your first box, along with a 20% discount on the following 2 months, plus free desserts for life. Or you can scan the QR code. And now, back to the story. 40 years of peace came to an end in 1863, when the Ashanti again crossed the Pra River, which acted as the border with the British colony of the Gold Coast. However, the war then ended in stalemate, with both sides losing more men to disease than to fighting. The Third Anglo-Ashanti War, which began in 1873, saw British General Sir Garnet Wolseley march all the way to Kumasi, winning several battles en route, before ransacking and burning a large part of the capital. The two sides agreed a peace treaty, and Wolseley returned to the coast and a career that would include the commanding of the British conquest, in all but name, of Egypt, and the failed expedition to rescue Charles Gordon in Khartoum. The Ashanti, having agreed to pay reparations of 50,000 ounces of pure gold, continued to live outside the British Empire. However, the Confederation could not escape the growing European scramble for Africa, and it wasn't just the British who were eyeing up their lands. To the west, the French were closing in on their borders as they expanded their colony in the Ivory Coast. At the same time, to their east, the Germans had established the colony of Togoland. If that worried the Ashanti, it certainly worried the British. Not only did they consider the Ashanti, after 3 wars, as sort of part of their sphere of influence, but they also wanted to prevent their European rivals getting their hands on the Ashanti's palm oil and mineral resources. Following a series of civil wars between rival claimants to the throne, Pempeh I was finally crowned King of the Ashanti in 1888. For the next 8 years, he played a diplomatic game trying to ward off the Europeans, in particular the British, who wished to establish a protectorate over his kingdom. Now, I don't want to get into the history or the finer points of protectorates, but at a top line, they were a popular tool for Europeans to extend their control during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not just in Africa, but in Asia too. Fundamentally, the European power would offer to protect a weaker state in exchange for control over their external and indeed some internal affairs. Normally, they placed a diplomat in the capital who wielded considerable influence and indeed power over the local ruler. So, whilst nominally independent, a protectorate had lost considerable sovereignty and couldn't act against their protector's wishes, in particular making treaties with other countries. They were a colony in all but name. A point that was not lost on the Ashanti king, who politely but deftly swatted away British requests until 1896. In that year, the British finally lost patience and dispatched an expeditionary force under Robert Baden-Powell, future founder of the Boy Scout movement, to Kumasi to convince Pempeh that a British protectorate was a great idea after all. They also pointed out that the reparations agreed way back in 1874 still hadn't been paid in full. When Pempeh refused to pay the outstanding reparations and also refused the British offer of protection, he and about 30 of his key supporters and chiefs were exiled to the British colony of the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean. He would remain the king across the water for nearly 30 years. This so-called Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War, which was hardly a war at all, resulted in the British establishing their desired protectorate, and a diplomat called Resident installed in Kumasi. This resident, Cecil Armitage, also built a fort in the Ashanti capital, which was garrisoned by a small force of British African troops, principally from Nigeria. Unsurprisingly, the Ashanti resented the removal of their king and the enforcement of this British protectorate. But whilst the British believed that they were in charge, the Ashanti begged to differ. The king may be exiled, but the very symbol of the nation was still very much at large, the Golden Stool. The Ashanti saw the potency of the Golden Stool to their resistance to British rule, and the British saw it likewise. Outside of their control, it was a symbol of resistance. In their clutches, it symbolically would tell the Ashanti people who was the new boss in town. So the British resident now set out on an almost holy grail search for the Golden Stool, whilst the Ashanti kept one step ahead, moving it to secret locations. Finally, after searching in vain, Cecil Armitage contacted his boss, the Governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, asking him to add his weight in the matter. 49-year-old Hodgson was the son of a Dorset rector and was the former Postmaster General in British Guiana, now Guyana, who'd been in West Africa for well over a decade. In 1888, he was appointed Colonial Secretary of the Gold Coast, effectively Deputy Governor, before stepping up to the top job 10 years later. Now, with that experience, you might think that he would understand the Ashanti and their feelings towards the Golden Stool. However, Hodgson was a man very much of his age, bombastic, grave, and full of both his own superiority and that of the empire he served. Arriving in Kumasi with his wife and a small guard, on the 25th of March 1900, he addressed the leaders of the Ashanti dignitaries, and whilst they politely listened, he lectured them with these words. Your King Pempeh I is in exile and will not return to the Ashanti. His power and authority will be taken over by the representative of Queen Victoria. The Queen is entitled to the stool. She must have it. Whilst hectoring in tone, his demand probably wasn't a shock to the Ashanti. After all, they knew the British wanted the Golden Stool. That's why they had been successfully hiding it from them. But it was what he said next that would lead to a war. A war that would cost hundreds of lives. Hodgson continued, Where is the Golden Stool? I am the representative of the paramount power. Why have you relegated me to this ordinary chair? Why did you not take the opportunity of me coming to Kumasi to bring the Golden Stool to me to sit upon?" His demand was met by a stunned silence. No one sat on the Golden Stool, not even their king. It was a sacred object. And now this mere governor, on behalf of Queen Victoria, wanted to plonk his white backside on it. You can imagine what was going on in the minds of the gathered Ashanti. Incredibly, based upon that faux pas, the meeting ended quietly and peacefully. But Hodgson had completely failed to read the room. That night, the shocked and angry Ashanti chiefs met to discuss the demand. And whilst they debated and debated and debated, a woman took to the floor and galvanised them into action. Yaa Asantewaa was the Queen Mother of Ajusi, one of the village states in the Ashanti Confederation. Now in her 60s, she goaded the men into resistance with a speech that rivals Queen Elizabeth I's speech to her troops before the Spanish Armada. "How can a proud and brave people like the Ashanti sit back and look while white men take away their king and chiefs and humiliate them with demands for the Golden Stool? The Golden Stool only means money to the white man. They've searched and dug everywhere for it." She continued, "If you, the chiefs of the Ashanti, are going to behave like cowards and not fight, you should exchange your loincloths for my undergarments." Ouch! What would you do if you were a chief? She then grabbed a rifle and fired it into the air and declared war on the British. The War of the Golden Stool had started. Now, whether they were in awe, inspired, or simply shocked, we don't know. But after that display, the assembled men appointed Yaa Asantewaa as their military commander, a role traditionally filled by men. The resulting war goes by several names. Technically, it was the Fifth Anglo-Ashanti War. The British also called it the Third Ashanti Expedition, seeing as two of the previous conflicts had been defensive wars following Ashanti invasions of the Gold Coast. But to many Ashanti and Ghanaians, it is known as the Yaa Asantewaa War. Now, apart from haranguing the chiefs and firing a rifle over their heads, this African Joan of Arc had another trick to galvanise the men into action. She urged women to withhold sex from their husbands unless they agreed to fight. Yep, that would probably do the trick. Meanwhile, blissfully unaware of the trouble he had set in motion, Hodgson now poured petrol on the flames when the next day he sent Armitage, accompanied by some troops, out to look for the Golden Stool. That afternoon, the party was surrounded by armed and very agitated Ashanti. Armitage decided to give them an example of British stiff upper lip and ordered his men to take afternoon tea. Folding chairs and tables were erected and tea duly served. I mean, it's like something from Carry On Up the Khyber. Although the Ashanti didn't see the funny side. They'd had enough and they opened fire. Armitage and his men fled back towards Kumasi. Arriving in the capital during a rainstorm, he reported the alarming news to Hodgson, who immediately moved into the small fort. He was accompanied by his wife, 16 Europeans, and 300 armed Hausa from Nigeria, who also possessed 6 7-pound mountain guns and 4 Maxim machine guns. As the news of the event spread, European and African civilians also turned up looking for safety. Whilst they had the numbers, the Ashanti were, rather wisely, cautious of the narrow front on which they would have to attack, and even more so, the carnage that those Maxims could inflict upon them. Consequently, they only made one serious assault on the fort, a few days later, on the 29th of April 1900, and then contented themselves with starving the British into submission, with the odd potshots from snipers to keep the British heads down. Meanwhile, down on the coast, the British authorities knew something was up when the telegraph lines to Kumasi were cut. A scratch force of local troops was assembled and sent north through the jungle. Eventually, after a month, having battled through barriers blocking the primitive road, they arrived at the Ashanti capital. If Hodgson was expecting to turn the tables on the Ashanti and their gun-totting female leader, he was sadly disappointed. Of the 250-strong force that had arrived from the coast, half were either wounded or were ill from tropical diseases. And worse, they had actually brought no extra supplies with them. So now they almost doubled the number of mouths that needed feeding and swelled the ranks of the besieged to nearly 600 people in the tiny fort. Already working on almost starvation rations and with disease spreading through his command, Hodgson watched as dozens died daily. And with no room for burials inside, their bodies were simply thrown outside the tiny fort. It would be another month before further assistance arrived. In June 1900, a second column numbering 700 troops from the West African Field Force under Major Morris battled their way through to Kumasi. En route, they had met determined opposition at a series of stockades that the Ashanti had built. These defensive fortifications were a departure from traditional Ashanti tactics, which some have credited to Yaa Asantewaa, although that's not definite. Whoever devised them, the stockades were proving a major headache for the advancing British. At one such fortification on the 6th of June, Sergeant John Mackenzie of the Seaforth Highlanders, but on secondment to the West Africa Frontier Force, worked 2 Maxims single-handed whilst under fire and wounded, before leading a bayonet charge which eventually captured the stockade. He was one of 2 men awarded the Victoria Cross during the War of the Golden Stool, and I'll tell you about the other one in a little while. By the time they reached Hodgson's fort, most of this force were also suffering from malnutrition. The governor now called a council of war, and it was agreed that the occupants of the fort, now numbering nearly 1,000, needed to break out or die of starvation. In the dead of night on the 23rd of June, most of the soldiers in the fort silently slipped out. They left behind most of the weakened civilian refugees, along with 25 fit and 90 slightly invalided troops, under the command of a captain and a medical officer, and were told to hold on as long as they could. The evacuation was so quiet that the Ashanti were caught completely by surprise, and it took them 2 days to assemble a large force to give chase. But Hodgson's fleeing party had a head start, and having fought both to clear villages en route and rear guards against their pursuers, they finally crossed the Pra River that marked the border, and their pursuers gave up. They'd lost 2 British officers and 39 Nigerian Hulsa troops during their flight to safety. By the time that Hodgson had reached the coast, with his ailing wife being carried in a hammock, the Ashanti had something else to concentrate their minds. Another relief column was marching through the tough terrain towards Kumasi. And this time, the British meant business. Commanded by Major James Wilcox, this column consisted of 1,000 men, drawn from the Nigerian Regiment of the West Africa Frontier Force, the West Africa Regiment, the Central Africa Regiment, which would later become part of the King's Africa Rifles, the Sierra Leone Frontier Police, and detachments from the 1st and 2nd West Indian Regiments. Born in India in 1857, where his father was serving in the East India Company Army, Wilcox was a tough veteran of wars in Afghanistan, Sudan, Burma, and the Waziri expedition on the northwest frontier of India. He had been in command of the West Africa Field Force since 1898, and had confidently, if not bullishly, announced that he would enter Kumasi on the 15th of July, the day that the tiny garrison's food supplies were predicted to run out. To assist him in his endeavour, apart from his 1,000 fighting men, he also had 6 artillery pieces and 6 Maxim machine guns. This was some firepower against the Ashanti, who, whilst numerically superior, and many were armed with rifles, which they fired with impressive accuracy, were not the fighting force that Garnet Wolseley had encountered back in the 1870s. The confident Wilcox insisted on using bayonet charges to clear the stockades, and on one occasion, at Kokofu, his cavalier tactics rebounded on him, as his force were initially repulsed, losing over 80 men, mainly wounded. By the time his Yoruba troops had re-entered the stockade, they found it deserted. That, however, was his only setback, as his column relentlessly moved through the jungle towards the Ashanti capital, finally arriving on the 15th of July. Just as he had promised. The garrison was so feeble that they couldn't even cheer his arrival, and many could barely stand. Having secured Kumasi, Major Wilcox immediately sent out flying columns to secure the remaining stockades. On the 30th of September, the final stockade at Obasa fell to yet another bayonet charge, this time led by Captain John Mellis. The officer, who was serving in the North Nigeria Regiment, which was part of the West Africa Frontier Force, was awarded the 2nd Victoria Cross of the campaign. Back in London, the Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain announced the news of the Ashanti defeat. However, with the Boer War and the Boxer Rising in China in full flow, many MPs hardly bothered to comment. Although the young firebrand Liberal MP for Carnarvon, David Lloyd George, questioned why so much money had been spent and so many lives had been lost for the sake of a golden stool. He also questioned whether Governor Hodgson had requested the Golden Stool with government approval, or whether the whole war had been the result of his arrogance and ignorance. And Lloyd George was right to question both the morality of the war and its cost. British casualties, dead and wounded, numbered just over 1,000, and whilst figures for the Ashanti have been hard to determine, it's thought to number 2,000. The Kingdom of the Proud Ashanti was annexed into the British Empire as a Crown colony in 1901. Yaa Asantewaa was exiled to the Seychelles, along with another 30 senior Ashanti chiefs and leaders. The warrior Queen Mother would die on the Indian Ocean Islands in 1921, having never seen her homeland again. She is regarded as a national hero or heroine in Ghana to this day. And what happened to some of those characters who we've encountered in this story? Well, Sir Frederick Hodgson was moved sideways to become Governor of Barbados, which possibly indicates that the British government shared Lloyd George's views on his responsibility for starting the war. He died in 1925, aged 73. James Wilcox would go on to serve as a general on the Western Front during the First World War. Despite being in his 60s, he would twice be mentioned in dispatches. Finally becoming Governor of Bermuda, he died in 1926. Of the two men awarded the Victoria Cross, both Captain John Mellis and Sergeant John Mackenzie would also serve in the First World War. Mellis, rising to the rank of Major General in the Indian Army, would be hospitalised during the campaign in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and was captured at the Fall of Kut. He spent the rest of the war as a Turkish prisoner. John Mellis VC died in 1934 and is buried in the churchyard at Frimley in Surrey. Sergeant Mackenzie would rise from the ranks to become an officer in the Beds and Hearts Regiment. Major John Mackenzie VC was killed leading his men over the top on the Western Front in 1915. King Pempeh I of the Ashanti was finally allowed to return home in 1924 after 28 long years in exile. He would continue his reign until his death in 1931. He was succeeded as monarch by his nephew, Pempeh II. And what of the Golden Stool that had sparked this whole war? Well, it remained hidden and the British would never get their hands, let alone their bums, on it. In 1921, the British finally renounced their claims to the Golden Stool. And somewhat ironically, just when it was finally safe from the British, it was discovered by some African workmen who proceeded to strip it of some of its precious metal. Tried according to local custom, they were sentenced to death, only for the British to intervene and banish the culprits into exile instead. Eventually brought out of hiding, the Golden Stool was used at the coronation of Pempeh II. The monarchs of the Ashanti continue to reign to this day inside Ghana and continue to act as custodians of the Golden Stool. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story from the tail end of Queen Victoria's British Empire. It's a little known story in Britain, but sure as heck in the Ashanti region of Ghana, it is well remembered and very proudly so. And once more, thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this show, and don't forget to click on the link on the screen or in the description and use the exclusive code THC50 to get 50% off your first box along with 20% discounts on your following 2 months, plus those free desserts. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.